Hi everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to lesson 8. We have got down to the final character, Eric. We've come to this point where we've left Mrs. Burling with agitated, and she said, "Don't believe it, I won't believe it." So the inspector has hinted that Eric may be implicated somehow with Eva Smith too. So we need to find out what is his secret and will he react like his parents. So before we go on to the actual quotes like we usually do, we just want to talk about Eric and what we know about him so far. Does anybody want to start off with what we've learned about Eric so far?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So yes, as Miss Wan's just said, we're going to learn what his secret is. The audience, is quite important for us to remember that the audience of and Sheila have already sort of got there first when Mrs. Burling is talking about how how the father should be responsible and all of that. The audience are kind of a few steps ahead, and again that's a deliberate attack by Priestley to make sure that we have already guessed that Eric is going to be the father of Eva Smith's child. So when he comes back in, it's really dramatic then, because we know that we're going to find out exactly what the story is and how it's all happened. But in terms of a bit of a wrap up of what we've got about Eric so far in the play and what we've touched on in previous lessons, in the stage directions, we commented on the description of him being half shy and half assertive, which is again a great quote to memorise for Eric. So there's this idea that he's a very unsure character. He's sort of just starting out into adulthood, really, and he's really not very confident, not very comfortable in his own skin. We know that he has a drink problem, which becomes apparent throughout the play, and he's in the stage directions. Priestley shows us that he's obviously used to hard drinking and has an issue with that, and that comes through in the play. We also have commented on the idea that, as well as that, however, he does show a glimmer of a much more kind of forward thinking a character, like the other younger generation characters. So Eric and Sheila both show hints that they are more forward thinking. So for example, at the beginning we see him standing up to his father, talking about, you know, that there's going to be a war, and also talking about the idea that Eva Smith should be able to ask for higher wages if she wants to. And he's immediately shut down. So we get a sense as well that he's a character that doesn't have a very comfortable relationship with his father, and that we'll explore a little bit later on in this lesson as well. What else do we need to say about Eric, ladies?
I think I like your start, Mrs. Marshall. I think to add to that, I guess the idea, the fact that he's downstage in the stage with the staging also indicates that, you know, he might be distant from his family, but also it can probably hint at this level of secrecy that he's got. The fact that and though, you know, it becomes apparent that he has got a drinking problem, that's been hidden away from his parents, and I think that's quite important, that he's got this nature to him that's, because he's not close to his parents, he has to hide certain elements. And although he does try and sort of assert himself when Mr. Burling talks about all these things that won't happen, like the war, because he doesn't have the confidence, because I don't think he was raised in a nurturing environment which allowed him to sort of fully realize his opinions. And so there was a person who's in some ways maybe quite damaged from the way that he's been brought up.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
he's kind of uncomfortable with his masculinity as well, isn't he, in terms of he's always sort of like infantilized by should I say, by his father, and so it's been made quite clear that Mr. Burling expects him to kind of take over take part in the business and sort of behave in a certain way that Eric clearly isn't comfortable with, and so I don't think he really knows how to sort of behave like the man that his father wants him to be. And I think a lot of that comes into what happens with Eva Smith later on as well.
Yeah, I was just about to say. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
You go, Miss Harrison.
Do you think that's why Berlin says as well to Gerald, "You're just the kind of son-in-law I've always wanted"? It's kind of like he's wanted Gerald to Eric to kind of live vicariously through. He wants Eric to be exactly like Gerald, and I think that's why Eric's like quite the black sheep of the family, that he doesn't fit in, you know, whereas even Sheila at the beginning, you know, she's playing up to this kind of Wardian middle class daughter of, you know, oh mummy, look, isn't it a beauty, and things like that, whereas I think Eric is very much on the perimeter of the family rather than actually within the family unit. And that's why we don't see him very much. We only see him briefly. He only gets a few kind of dialogue bits in the first act, and he's not present at all in Act 2. And then once, obviously, when we get to analyse him, stay in Act 3, he's very much a changed character.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So that's just a bit of a summary on Eric. Shall we go on to the first quote? I think Mrs. Marshall's first today.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Right. Okay, here we are.
Hit me with it. Yeah, fantastic. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what Eric actually does, in the sense that in his grilling from the inspector, it's revealed that effectively he potentially raped Eva Smith, and it's not 100% clear, and that's mainly because of the way that it's worded in this quote. When the inspector questions Eric, and he does allow him to tell his story, and he doesn't actually say that much, he just hints in, you know, chips in now and again, so he allows Eric to sort of tell the full story of what happened, and yet we, the audience, really have to read between the lines to perhaps understand the full extent of what happened. And whereas we've talked about in previous lessons Gerald's treatment of Eva, or Daisy, Eric's is quite shocking, really. He sort of represents the sort of typical middle class male behaviour of what would be expected, for how they would treat a woman like Eva Smith. He sort of lives up to that, and in this tale, we'll read the quote through first together. We're going to look at how he deals with it. So he says, "Yes, I insisted, it seems. I'm not very clear about it, but afterwards she told me she didn't want me to go in, but that, well, I was in a state where a chap really turns nasty, and I threatened to make a row. So she let you in?" "Yes, and that's when it happened, and I didn't even remember. That's the hellish thing. Oh my God, how stupid it all is." So there's quite a lot here to focus on. First of all, the way in which he tells it. A bit like Gerald uses euphemisms. If you remember, we visited that word on a previous lesson. A euphemism is to tell something in a less unpleasant way, or to try and make something sound not as bad as what it is. And I think his euphemistic language here shows how uncomfortable he is with revealing what he has done to her, essentially. It's quite clear here that she did not consent. She told him that she didn't want him to go into the flat, and so with this bit of information, we're really reading between the lines. We can work out that he's forced himself upon her, and that he, perhaps in retelling the story, is sort of realizing how much force he perhaps used. It's also unclear because of the state he was in. It's clear that he was drunk, and he struggles to remember it exactly. So we're told in the second part of the quote, and he realizes at this moment how awful it is. Not only has he forced himself upon her, but that he's even can't even remember it for all that he's gained from it. He doesn't even really know what happened. There's lots of clip speech here, lots of hyphens. But there's also a mixture of his kind of euphemistic language, where he's trying to distance himself perhaps from the truth of what he's actually done, showing again well, maybe how uncomfortable he is, but also showing perhaps that he's struggling to deal with, perhaps starting to show some remorse of how horrified he is with his own behaviour almost, even when he's telling the story. But also he uses sort of this colloquial language, like a chap turns nasty. Again, the mixture of the language there shows how uncomfortable he is in this moment. And this sort of fragmented speech as well. It shows that he's almost kind of allowing himself to go through this transformation before the audience and before the other characters, where he's realizing what he's done. And also it's showing this idea that he although what he's done is arguably the worse than what anyone else, like Sheila, at least feeling bad about it and at least admitting it. So you get the dashes there, again the clip speech, and he realizes the sort of consequences of his actions. His and Eva's baby, although it's not a character in the play and it never comes to be, is quite a significant symbol that you could think about in writing about the play, because the potential baby would represent this uniting of the two classes in a way. And it's quite significant that it's aborted at the end, perhaps showing this idea that of the fact that it's perhaps impossible for it to ever be in some ways, but also perhaps highlighting some of Priestley's points about class in the play. What do you reckon, guys?
Yeah, brilliant. I really love that quote as well. Yeah, I think there's a lot of quite emotive language, especially in that last bit. That's a hellish thing. You can kind of really start to see, like Mrs. Marshall's already said, that he's going through this process just along with the other characters, but whereas I think there's a real big difference here between the young and older characters. He, just like Sheila, is really taking it in and kind of realising the impact his selfish behaviour has on people like Eva Smith, and that in itself is kind of like a microcosm for bigger issues in society. So how middle and upper class people took advantage and kind of profited in more ways than one at the expense of working class people.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the fact that the inspector uses the question, "So she let you in," I think that actually shows you that sort of abuse of power, because she inevitably sort of, is the right word, relents, because he if we're looking at this idea that they're both constructs of the class system, Eric being a middle class male, and then you've got Eva, the working class female, you've got this idea that she's sort of overpowered in that sense because of the class system that they belong to, because he can exploit that power for his own benefit. I know when we think about sort of the characters of Eric and Eva, it also plays into this idea of gender as well, not just class, and we can see those two dynamics in play. And earlier to what Mrs. Marshall said about the idea of masculinity, I think because he's so like repressed by his dad, and this idea that he is seen as some sort of disappointment to Mr. Burling, this masculinity is kind of, like I said, damaged him in some way, because he's proven his masculinity, but in a very violent manner. Is what
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what we've got to examine in his character, really, in terms of asking the question about, is he like his parents? We've looked, when we looked at Sheila, we looked at her, examined the language that she uses, like the fact that she repeats the same word, impertinent, that she's obviously got from her mother. And so we see how she's almost been shaped by her parents into doing behaving the way that she has. But then as soon as it's revealed to her, she sort of admits it and sort of moves forward towards the transformation. And in that same way, I suppose if we're looking at an essay on Eric, we've got to look at how he's been shaped by his parents. Is he like them? Is an interesting way of putting it, or he's been influenced by them, certainly. The point you just made about his sort of negative way that he asserts his masculinity is really, really important. But also his inability to express his emotions as well, like when he tells his father, you're not the sort of father that a chap can come to when they're in trouble. And it's quite clear that he has never been able to really express himself in a healthy way, and so therefore he's turned to drink, and he's turned to sort of male expectations about aggressive masculinity in order to try and find his place in the world and trying to assert himself. Definitely.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I like that. And I guess, you could actually say, if we're going back to the question, is Eric like his parents? Maybe that is why he's turned to drink, because he maybe despises the ideology that they represent, and he's part of it. And that's probably why he does turn to the drink in order to sort of forget what he is.
Yeah.
Shall we go to Miss Harrison's quote?
Yeah, let's do it.
There we are.
Okay, guys. So my quote is after the inspectors left. So you've already studied this in year 9. The big final socialist speech from the inspector. We are responsible for each other, fire, blood and anguish, and that kind of thing. So what I think's really important to note within this quotation is the socialist message that's still being driven home to the older Berlins and Gerald. Obviously, we've already mentioned previously about Eric's shyness and him being him lacking self-confidence, and him kind of almost fading into the background in the beginning of the play. He had a few moments where he piped up to Berlin, but other than that, he's been quite quiet. And it's after his interrogation with the inspector that kind of almost parallels the inspector and Priestley himself, obviously. So we've got this stage direction at the beginning where he's shouting, and I say the girl's dead and we all helped to kill her, and that's what matters. So we've got this quite aggressive, violent verb shouting, which very much juxtaposes his opening stage directions of being shy. So I think that is quite an important thing to know. Obviously, yeah, we've got the anger, but it's also how passionate he is about what's happened to Eva Smith, and the fact that, not only someone that he had some affection for, but also his unborn child have died at mercilessly at the hands of these tyrants, like Berlin and Mrs. Berlin. So that's the obvious thing to pick out. And then we've got the blunt, emotive language that the inspector uses throughout. Key quotes to pick up from the inspector are things like laying on a slab with her insides burnt out. She died in agony, hating life. He mentions that she's dead a lot, and uses this kind of blunt, emotive language to shock us and to shock the Berlins, and almost frighten them into submission, I suppose. But obviously it's had little to no effect on the old Berlins. So Eric is kind of still wanting to change his parents. What the inspector has said to him has made a great impact on him, and that's clear. And I think that's why his message is reflected through Eric's speech and what he says and how he says it to people. I think what's also important to know is the use of syntax in this quote. So just to remind you, syntax is the use of word order to create meaning. So the second half of this quote is the fact that the Berlins killed Eva Smith, and that's what matters. Obviously, with the inspector gone now, the whole kind of conspiracy theory, was he a real police inspector? We've been had, it's all a hoax. That is what the older Berlins are really clinging on to, because remember, what they don't want is this to become a public scandal and for their reputation to be left in tatters. But Eric isn't concerned about that at all. He's concerned about the impact his behaviour and the rest of his family, what their behaviour has done to Eva Smith and his unborn child. So the fact that he's focusing on their death and what they did to her that led to her death is kind of indicative of the social responsibility message that the inspector drives home, or tries to drive home, to the Berlins all the way through the play. So that is what Eric is wanting the Berlins to realise, and it's obvious that isn't the case. And I think it's also as well that the Berlins, especially Mr. and Mrs. Berlin, they don't respect him. They see him as, some Mrs. Berlin even refers to him before she knows it's Eric as a drunken young idler. So she sees his behaviour as something kind of disgusting. And before she backtracks and says, well, I didn't understand the situation, I didn't know it was you, it's clear that they see Eric as something laughable. There's a few moments in the beginning of the play when it's almost like Berlin and Gerald are kind of tag teaming him, and they see him as, they don't respect him, they don't take him seriously when he tries to voice his opinions. So that could be another reason why the older characters don't change, even though this socialist message is still being driven home to them in the latter bit of the play. It's because they don't take it seriously. So another thing to kind of pick up on is I've already mentioned about the blunt emotive language, and that harkens back to the inspector's final speech, I think. And obviously this would have been played to a 1945 audience, as we've already mentioned previously in other lessons. And the big kind of message in that final speech from the inspector is, if society doesn't change, then things like this will continue to happen. And I think what's really important to note with that point is that use of the inclusive pronoun we, or the collective pronoun we all helped to kill her. And this even shows a bit of a change in Eric as well, because in the beginning, when the inspector's first interrogating him, he kind of points the finger at Mrs. Berlin and says, you killed her, you and my unborn child, damn you, damn you. Whereas now he's kind of including himself in that responsibility, and he's not just saying, it was my responsibility, it's all of our responsibility. So it's driving home that socialist message of collective responsibility. And I also think, while we've said previously that Eric is lacking in self-confidence, is probably a bit immature in how he goes about things, I think this quote shows a real maturity in him. And I think particularly in this bit when the inspector's left, I think there's almost like been a role reversal between the younger and older characters. The older characters, like Mr. and Mrs. Berlin and even Gerald, seem to be quite immature in how they're reacting. They're just wanting to get out of trouble. It's like a child trying to cover things up, not wanting to get in trouble by the parents. Whereas Eric is taking a very mature stance on it all and saying, well, the fact that this girl's dead and we all helped to drive her to that is what matters, not how we can cover this all up and get ourselves out of any trouble. So I think that shows a real maturity in him. And that was something along with the fact that he's shouting it, is something would have been quite uncommon for Edwardian children. You know, in the beginning, we see that through Sheila, where she tries to behave in a way that her parents would want her to, and so does Eric, by the fact that he's very secretive about his you know, kind of negative behavior, whereas now he doesn't really care what they think. He's, you know, he's very much kind of distancing himself from the older characters, and kind of driving home his message and his ideas, which is, you know, something that the inspector and kind of Priestley believed as well, that it was going to be through the younger generations with ideas about, you know, class fluidity, gender not being kind of stuck into specific boxes and things like that. They were going to be the ones that were going to drive that kind of change in society. So yeah, really, really good quote for Eric. I really like this one. Have any of you guys got anything to add?
You've owned that quote.
I owned
it. There's nothing left in that quote to say. You've turned that quote into an entire grade 9 essay on Inspector Calls. Super, amazing. Yeah, I really liked your mirroring of language points. I think those are really important to drive home, really important for people to make notes on at home about the mirroring of language, with the way that he starts to speak more like the inspector and even picking up on the pronouns in the speech. I love that idea. And I think he's a great character for looking at how he sort of embodies how that sort of conflict in the whole play between sort of individual pursuit of power and obviously the collective, the whole, the more socialist agenda that obviously Priestley is going for. And also the fact that, again, the emotional thing that we touched on earlier as well, about him being so lost as a character. He's somebody that you can relate to a lot more, even though he's done the worst thing. You can relate to him a lot more, and see him for his honesty at the end, rather than somebody like Gerald, who is so seedy the way he covers things up, and obviously he doesn't have the redemption like Eric does, because obviously he comes back triumphant, still caring about the individual rather than focusing on the collective, as you've just expertly talked about. Yeah, fabulous.
Yeah, I really I think he's, like you said, even though he's done such abhorrent things, he is a very likable character.
Yeah, just this lost little kid, isn't he?
We're all rooting for Eric.
Yeah, even though he's awful, but he's like, he, you know, at least he's a product. I think it's important for us to write about him as a product of his parents' upbringing, and that kind of restlessness that he has, that dissatisfaction. Why can't I speak tonight? Dissatisfaction. I've put my false teeth in. It really embodied that sort of spirit of 1945 and the voters voting for Attlee, and, you know, all of that. You know, Eric and Sheila would be, as we've discussed in other lessons, they would have been the audience of 1945, and the Burlings would have been like their stuck in the past parents. So it's important to remember the age of the people going to the theatre. They would have been the ones that they would have sympathised with.
Yeah, and I think the reason why we like Eric more than Gerald is the fact that, if you know, there is a more human side to Eric, in the sense that he is a flawed character, and all humans are not perfect, and I think the audience can sympathise with that. Particularly, I think, if you're looking at a young generation that are going to go watch this in 1945, and most likely may have had strict upbringings as well, and maybe understand that there is a wish to be more progressive and break out of these traditional roles, and so in some way would sympathize with people like Eric and Sheila, whereas Gerald, who we know we all hate in this group, he strives to be perfect and tries to look perfect, and I think sometimes the audience can see through that a little bit. It's a bit more transparent, and I think that's part of the reason why we might not like Gerald, because of his seemingly perfect character, whereas Eric is flawed. I think that's where the sympathy lies a bit with him.
And he just care about that, whereas Gerald has not done anything any different really in terms of abuse of power, but he doesn't care as long as how he's viewed. He only cares about how he's viewed, doesn't care about the actual truth underneath.
Yeah. Eric's a bit more complex than I give him credit for.
I think so, yeah. I think there's a lot more to him. And I think he's used quite cleverly in terms of what he represents.
Yeah, I always seem, every year I do this, I always seem to learn a little bit more about these characters.
I know.
Yeah.
I love it. I love this play. I'm such a massive geek on this play. I love it. Every time I read it, there's like other bits in it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And every time I find something new. I think if the people I hang out with, you and Miss Harrison, you teach me a lot.
Maybe we just spend too much time together.
Yeah.
Shall I move on to my quote?
Yeah, we're desperate to know about what your quote is. Come on.
Yeah.
Much more you guys have done such a great job, but I'll try my best. So at this point, the inspector's left, and next week we're going to look at the inspector's final speech as a standalone session. And what we've got here is what Eric's left with. So we've got the impression that by now the Burlings are quite glad, because I think Gerald's come back and implied that the inspector may not be an inspector. And so they're pretty pleased because, like Miss Harrison said earlier, they don't want this to come out as a public scandal. So we've got Eric and Sheila, and when we focus on Eric's reaction, he puts, whoever that chap was, the fact remains that I did what I did, and Mother did what she did, and the rest of you did what you did to her. So I think that repetition of the auxiliary verb did is a reminder of the role that the Burlings actively had in the death of Eva Smith. So it's a reminder. But also the separation, I think, is quite interesting, because we've got Eric's acceptance with the first person pronoun. I did what I did. So he accepts that he had a part to play. And then he reminds Mrs. Burling, who refuses to accept her responsibility, you had a part to play. And then the rest of you did what you did to her. So by separating that, he reminds each individual that they are part of the chain of events in the abuse of power that led Eva to killing herself. And then I want us to go think about the sentence that he says after. It's still the same rotten story, whether it's been told to a police inspector or to somebody else. So when I think about I think it's an adverb, same. It's still the same. Reminds us that Eva Smith, if we are correct in thinking that Priestley's used her as a construct of all working class women, it reminds us that they are victims to the upper middle classes, and victims that would have suffered the same fate, because there would have been many women, if they were working class and if they were unemployed like Eva found herself, and we've seen the journey that she's taken, the reluctant journey into prostitution, then going to the charity organisation Mrs. Burling ran, and each place is rejected her. And so what we've got here is a reminder with that adverb that all people could be subject to this treatment. And I like the idea of the fact that he uses the noun story. I think it gives me this idea of it's a narrative, and when we have a narrative, it can be controlled, and the people that control this story ultimately people like the Burlings, and what they've got is the outcome is the ending is that Eva is dead. and they're responsible for that. And if they had controlled the narrative in a more kinder way, she could have had a different journey and a different outcome. But if they actually did choose to help her and took that social responsibility, and I think when I look at this sentence, it's still the same rotten story. He as well as Sheila, that they understand, and what the older generation don't understand is that they understand that they are part of a systemic problem, that they have created a system in which that it's full of inequalities, and whilst they benefit off of it, so they've got this sense of privilege, there are many others that have to suffer so that they actually have a better quality of life. And because they're so scared of losing, like we said with I think Mrs. Berlin last week, they're so scared of losing any form of status or threatened by it, okay, they'd rather have all these people suffer, okay, and experience the same outcome as Eva, so just so that they can have a better life, and they don't care. And I think this is why we've got this adjective rotten. So I think this adjective rotten can allude to either the corrupt nature of the Burlings, and they have acted in a corrupt way, whether it's morally, in terms of Gerald having an affair with Eva Smith, or Eric raping her, or Mrs. Burling refusing help, and then you've got Mr. Burling who didn't pay her a fair wage. I think that actually represents the adjective rotten also represents that moral decay of the middle classes. They view themselves as people that are morally superior because they've got money. And what we've got time and time again is Priestley reminding us that money doesn't buy you morality. And that's why I think it's important that Eva refuses to take any money from Eric once she learns where it's come from. I think she does know that he's taken it, and I think this sort of washes away what Mrs. Berlin thinks of the working class, that when she calls Eva Smith girls of that sort, she obviously has a preconceived idea that they act immorally and they will take what they can get. And actually Eva takes the upper hand here, and she shows you that actually that's not the case. And so that's why I chose this quote, because I just feel like it's still the same rotten story. It's quite a powerful statement by Eric. He recognises that they've controlled this narrative all the way through, and he understands this idea of a chain of events, whereas Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling and Gerald, they all try and absolve themselves of responsibility. And so when he separates with the auxiliary verb did, it kind of just reminds you again to the audience, don't forget, even if the inspector's not real or whatever the purpose of the inspector is, just remember that if we continue to act this way, this could be the outcome for everybody else. If anybody else has got anything to add to that.
Yeah, brilliant analysis as always, Miss Wan. What I think is good to note as well, like you've said about the repetition of did, again it's kind of paralleling the inspector's not the final speech, but one of the final things that he says to each member of the family is he goes through each one and says, your father turned her away from a factory, then she got her kicked out of a job. So again, it's him kind of paralleling this idea, the inspector's message of social and collective responsibility. And like you've already pointed out with that adjective rotten, I think it's kind of quite telling of the fact that Sheila uses that adjective as well earlier on in the play, but she does use it, and she says, I felt rotten about it at the time and now I felt a lot worse. And I think you've already mentioned about decay, and that one of the definitions of that adjective is to suffer from decay. And I think it can also, while you've kind of mentioned it on a more kind of wide scale about it kind of politically and nationally about the capitalist system kind of rotting away society and it not being very conducive to a good way of living for everyone. I think it's also very telling of how they are dealing with Eva Smith's death on a personal level. It's almost like eating away at them and kind of shedding their beliefs, what they had in the beginning and how they viewed themselves as people. I think Eva Smith's story is very much a transformative one in the younger characters of Eric and Sheila.
Yeah. And also the idea that the bit where he says it doesn't matter who it's been told to, as Miss Wan's already said about the idea of the story narrative, he's realised his place within the structure. It's the structure that he's criticising. So I agree with you. I think it has hit them on an individual level, but it's much bigger than that as well, isn't it? They're realising that they hold a position in this hierarchy, which is basically not allowing others to thrive. It's preventing other people from moving forward, and for a society as a whole from progressing. And so when he says at the end, whether it's been told to a police inspector or to somebody else, sorry about my voice, the somebody else bit I think is quite important, because it's deliberately deliberately ambiguous. Who is that somebody else? It's almost as though he realizes that they almost answer to a higher kind of moral judgment, that it's not just about the police that might represent a structure, which also, as we've already seen in the play, have been shown to be corrupt. I mean, him mentioning, I don't know what's happened to my voice, sorry guys, Mr. Marshall here. Earlier in the play, we've already talked about how they try to name drop Colonel Roberts, and the older Burnings show that they have these kind of corrupt links with who they play golf with and who they sit on the bench with. So that structure, that police structure, it doesn't matter whether it's been, it kind of represents already that internal corruption that's there. But the somebody else suggests that there's more that you have to add to, and it could be a reference to the audience. Somebody else, is Priestley empowering the audience at this point in the play through Eric to say, look, you are the somebody else that can make your own judgment about who's responsible here. And even if this girl never existed, all of these things, all of these structures still exist in which the upper classes are able to exert and their power over and exploit the working classes, and they should answer to that higher moral power, I suppose, is what he's saying.
And so to conclude, is Eric like his parents?
No.
No, I don't.
No, definitively. He's definitely not at the end.
No, I think he starts off, I think he has been severely damaged by his parents. He's not like them. I think that all of his problems stem from his upbringing. And I think he's become what could be a very unlikable character based on his actions, but that because of his redemption, because of his realization of what he's done, he therefore becomes somebody that represents something a lot more optimistic about the future.
He's a bit more salvageable, I think.
Yeah,
salvageable, and thankfully not anything like Mr. Burling. So that's what we're going to end there today.
Absolutely.
Until next time. We've got 2 more parts, haven't we? The Inspector and the actual ending, which we'll talk about. So hopefully everyone's going to be able to have some good revision notes by the end of these sessions.
Yay.
Yay. Yay.
Yay.
Right. So we end there then?
We'll end there, yeah.
Okay, goodbye.
Okay, goodbye.
Okay,
bye.
Bye.
Just going to stop recording.